Good afternoon, and welcome back to our sixth lecture on how we got the Bible. Today we're going to be looking at the ancient translations of the Old Testament. Recall the Old Testament is originally written in Hebrew and small portions in Aramaic, but we also have some translations from that original writing into other languages, and that's those texts, those major ones at least, that I want to talk about today. The first one we're going to talk about is the Samaritan Pentateuch. The word Pentateuch, you notice penta, like in pentagon, the five-sided polygon shape. Pentateuch refers to the first 5 books of the Old Testament, sometimes called the Torah, which is the Hebrew word for law. But before we talk about the Pentateuch, we're going to talk about the history of the Samaritans. Around 722 BC, the Assyrian Empire is the world empire. They're in charge. They're the ones who are pushing people around, and they come into northern Israel and they conquer northern Israel, taking away most of the people. There are a few of the Israelites who are left, and the Assyrian Empire moves in foreigners. Now, part of the Israelite law was you're not supposed to intermarry with foreign peoples. However, the Israelites who are there ignore that law. They do intermarry with the foreign peoples, and their descendants become known as the Samaritans. Well, around 605 BC, Babylon has taken the world over in the Middle East, and they are the dominant world power at the time. They conquer Jerusalem, and they conquer the southern area of Israel, take away some captives, and there's several other captivities that happen. So finally, in 587, they destroy Jerusalem and they take away the rest of the people because Jerusalem won't submit to the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. But around 536, Babylon's conquered by the Persians and the Israelites get to go home. Well, when they come home back to Jerusalem and they begin to rebuild the temple and they begin to rebuild Jerusalem, the Samaritans come and they want to worship with them and they want to associate with them. And the Jews say, we can't do that. You intermarried with these other people. And that was against the law. Well, that makes the Samaritans mad, and so there's a big schism that happens that will then last for several hundred years, and you can read about that in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, and it's the reason why in John 4, the woman at the well who is a Samaritan is talking to Jesus, and she says to Jesus, why are you talking to me? And John notes that Samaritans have no dealing with Jews and vice versa. And so that all happens back during the Old Testament time periods around 500s to 400s BC. So the contents of the Samaritan Pentateuch, the document we're interested in, is just those first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis through Deuteronomy. So it's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The Samaritans, and you might guess why, say the rest of the Old Testament is not inspired. Now again, they've just been hurt, basically, by the Jews when they say, no, you can't associate with us. Also, in the rest of the Old Testament, Jerusalem becomes the place of worship. It becomes the elevated mountain. Mount Zion is constantly referred to as God's mountain or the Lord's place throughout the rest of the Old Testament. Well, they're not allowed to be a part of the people of Zion. You can understand why they would say the rest of the Old Testament isn't inspired. But in regards to the first 5, there are actually just slight, they are significant, but just slight changes. The vast majority of those changes, however, have to do with places. Again, they basically are told, no, you can't worship in the temple. You can't have full relations with the people of Israel anymore because you've broken the law. And so they change different events and the locations of those events. But by and large, the rest of it is pretty much the same. The laws aren't really changed. The expectations God has for the people aren't really changed. Other than places and who gets to be priests and things like that, it generally agrees with the Masoretic text. And so for that reason, there is some value. Now, again, you have to realize there's a clear bias here. And so are we going to prefer the Samaritan Pentateuch text over the Hebrew text when we know historically there's a clear bias? Well, probably not in most places. But like I said, generally, despite that clear bias, it supports the Masoretic text. It's also written in Paleo-Hebrew, meaning it is an old document. It's a copy of old documents. The Paleo-Hebrew font being used before Babylon comes and takes Israel into captivity. And as we've been saying, it generally agrees with the accepted Masoretic text that we have today. The next translation we're going to talk about is what we call the Aramaic Targums. The word Targum refers to a translation. A little bit of history, just like we did with the other one. We noted the Babylonian captivity. Nebuchadnezzar comes and he captures Israel, the southern Israel, and takes them into captivity. Well, that lasts for about 70 years. And when the people who return, who grew up in Babylon, and a lot of them end up speaking Aramaic as opposed to Hebrew. Now, Aramaic are similar, and Hebrew are similar languages. They're sister languages. In fact, modern-day Hebrew uses the Aramaic block font, block script, as opposed to the old Paleo-Hebrew block script. And when they come back, there's actually an event in Nehemiah 8, verse 8, where they're reading the law, but it says the priests give the sense of the law, which is probably they are having to translate and paraphrase the Hebrew reading into Aramaic because a lot of people can't fully get what's being said. Again, this is similar to talking about different dialects in the same language, or if you consider Spanish spoken in Spain versus Spanish spoken in one of the South American countries, there's a lot of similarity, but there are some differences, and some of that would have to be explained through someone who knew both of those languages. That's the kind of situation you have. So what is it? Traditionally, it was simply the oral paraphrase and explanation of the Old Testament in Aramaic. And so there was this Aramaic Targum that existed. This is the way we say it in Aramaic when someone doesn't understand the Hebrew. This is the way we translate it when someone isn't getting it in the Hebrew language. There was an official translation written down around the 5th century AD that took a very literal approach. Now again, these are very similar languages, so that makes being very literal way easier. The first part, called the Onkelos, has to do with the Torah, the Pentateuch, those first 5 books of the Old Testament. And then the second part being the prophets, called Jonathan. You remember, modern breakdown of the Hebrew Bible has it into 3 sections: the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. And so the writings being primarily the poetic sections, Psalms, Job, Proverbs, those books. There doesn't seem to be an official Aramaic Targum for those. Just seems to be the Torah and the prophets being history books / the messengers in those history time periods. And its value, again, it supports the Masoretic text very closely. Because it is a very little translation, it gives us a good backdrop that these are indeed supporting the Masoretic readings we have today. Again, these are translations, and so there is some barrier in being as valuable as a Hebrew text would be, but they do basically say, yeah, the Masoretes did a good job copying and reconstructing these texts to match the originals. The third translation we're going to talk about is actually one we've already mentioned, the Syriac Peshitta, and this is one that had to do with the Old and New Testament. If you remember, Syriac is another sister language to Aramaic and Hebrew, sometimes called Eastern Aramaic. And if you remember, by the 5th century AD, the Syriac churches are saying, this is our official text. This is what we're going to use to teach and read in our worship assemblies. And in regards to New Testament, they had to make a special effort to remove the diatessaron, that harmony of the 4 Gospels made by Tatian. And Lightfoot suggests, however, that the Old Testament began around the 1st century AD. And he doesn't really go elaborate into why he makes that suggestion, but that is what he says. Now, the word Peshitta means simple. This is intended to be easy to understand, easy to read. However, the earliest Peshittas we have seem to be very similar to the Masoretic text. Again, these aren't taking the very literal translation approach that the Targums did, but they do seem to support the Masoretic text. We also see influence of the Septuagint over time. The later forms seem to be closer to the Septuagint text. We'll talk more about what is the Septuagint and what it means to be close to its form when we get to that translation. But before we talk about Septuagint, one more, also a very important translation, being the Latin Vulgate. Remember, Jerome is commissioned to translate, or actually revise, the Latin New Testament around 382 BC. Not BC, AD, 382 AD. And the reason for that is the Old Latin translation of the New Testament was probably done mostly by individuals or small groups for their particular church or in their particular area they're trying to evangelize. And so you had these different translations from the Greek that communicated basically the same thing, but didn't read exactly the same. And so Damasius, the Bishop of Rome decides that he wants there to be an official translation, and he commissions Jerome to revise that. Well, Jerome, being a good scholar, wants to revise it in line with the Greek text as opposed to just whatever Latin text says or whatever his preference is. And so he does the first 4 Gospels. He faces quite a bit of opposition because it sounds different, it reads different than the people are used to. Probably partially because of that opposition, and when Damasus dies, probably falls somewhat out of favor because some people don't like his translation. He ends up moving to Palestine later in his life, and he learns Hebrew. He gets a Jewish guy to teach him Hebrew, and he sets about translating the Old Testament from Hebrew into Latin. So while his New Testament work was really a revision, the Latin Old Testament is actually a true translation. He's going from Hebrew into Latin. On top of that, he continues to face opposition because he's not using the Septuagint. A lot of the Christian scholars of that day saw the Septuagint as the inspired writing of God. Baffles me a little bit because we know the Septuagint was written after the Hebrew versions were, so I'm not sure how the Hebrew versions can't be the inspired versions and the Septuagint is, and that was apparently Jerome's opinion, but nonetheless, he faced a lot of opposition. He had to constantly defend himself. Also, the content of this was the same as the modern Jewish Bible today. If you pick up a modern Jewish Bible, sometimes called the Tanakh, the content that he translated are the same contents, the same books he translated into Latin. Later, some deuterocanonical books, sometimes they're called, or apocryphal books were added to the Old Testament Latin Vulgate, such as the Book of Wisdom, or such as Ecclesiasticus, or Sirach might be some of the versions. So if you pick up a Catholic Bible, you may see books in there that another Bible you picked up didn't have. We mentioned that the Old Testament has 39 books. The Catholic version would have a couple more. But most Protestants or just non-Catholic followers of Jesus see the Old Testament as the same content as the Jewish Bibles, and they don't see these other apocryphal books as inspired. Jerome agreed, and this is one of the reasons that the Latin Vulgate, the Latin Old Testament, is quite valuable. For one, because he's translating from Hebrew, he's using Hebrew texts that are older than most of our own Hebrew texts. Again, he's translating around the 400s. Before we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, our oldest Hebrew texts were really around 900 AD. And so, you're jumping back several hundred years, the text that he's using to translate. And maybe you're not surprised by this anymore, but again, by and large, supporting the Masoretic text. It's also important for the issue of Old Testament canonicity. We'll talk about canonicity in a summary lecture next time. Canonicity is a big topic, which is the question of what book should be in the Bible. But we'll do a overview and maybe in the future be able to do a full series on deciding which ones should be in the Bible and why is that. But the fact that Jerome, who writes the original Latin Bible from Hebrew into Latin, he sees it as the same content as the Jews see it today and as most non-Catholics see the Old Testament today as well. And thus there is some significant importance to the Latin Vulgate. The last translation we're going to talk about today is what's called the Septuagint. The history of the Septuagint is pretty interesting. We get the story of the Septuagint from a document called the Letter of Aristeas, and he tells a story that one of the Ptolemies, there is a debate, is it Ptolemy the first or Ptolemy the second, but one of them decides they want a Greek version of the Torah, that they're building up their library, sometimes some of the versions say. And so they decide they want the great manuscripts of the world. There's a lot of Jews who live in Alexandria at the time, and so he sends to elders in Palestine and says, we want people to come and translate the Torah into Greek. And so the story goes that 6 elders from each of the 12 tribes, for a total of 72 men, come and they begin work on the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Supposedly they work on the island of Pharos. That was the island that had the famous lighthouse of Alexandria on it. And that's very likely true. Its contents, though, however, remember, is just the Torah. It's just the Pentateuch, which means the rest of the Old Testament was translated into Greek over time, probably not by this same committee and maybe not even by committees as much as just individuals or a couple people. And according to Geisler and Nix, the rest of the Old Testament should have been translated into Greek by around 150 AD. Now, there are some important things with that date, and we won't get into all of that right now. But from about 250 to 150 AD, the whole Septuagint, the whole Old Testament translated into Greek, should have come into existence. And so there is some real value to it. One, it's one of the oldest witnesses to the Hebrew text. These guys were using documents to translate from Hebrew into Greek that would have been older than probably anything we have, should be older than anything we have today. Again, we mentioned the Great Isaiah Scroll from the last lecture, and a lot of scholars think it's from around 100 BC. Well, that's definitely after these guys. So for that reason, especially in regards to the Torah, this is a very important witness. In regards to the Torah, it is highly supportive of the Masoretic text. It highly supports that the Masoretes did an excellent job in using good ancient documents to copy the Hebrew Bible. However, as you get into the other sections of the Septuagint that were not part of that original translation, there is a varied value, you might say, for it. Those other sections often tend to be a little bit longer. There tend to be more part of the stories, more things told than in the Masoretic text. And so there's a question: is that added? Is that legendary? Is that true? Just not part of the original version. And so there has to be this balancing act with the Septuagint, especially in the other books of the Old Testament. But there is something really interesting that sometimes happens. Sometimes the Septuagint in places will agree with the Samaritan Pentateuch, again, that just being the Pentateuch, over the Masoretic reading. And when that happens, most scholars believe, well, that was probably if the Septuagint and the Samaritan Pentateuch agree over the Masoretic text. Again, we're not changing meaning, we're not changing definition here, but that very likely means that that's probably closer to the original rendering. But like we said, it's important to also understand that this was not a closely guarded translation. The Jews didn't treat this version the way the Masoretes treated their versions. They didn't have the same kind of scribal rules and copying. And this is especially the case when the Christians started using the Septuagint to support faith in Jesus and quoting from it. Jesus and the apostles often quote from the Septuagint. When that begins to happen, the Jews basically disassociate themselves from the Septuagint because they think it's being abused and they don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah that's prophesied in the Old Testament. And for that reason, differences or changes between the Septuagint and the Masoretic text is more likely that the Masoretic text is closer to the original writing than the Septuagint, and hence there is this balance that has to be achieved. However, it is a very important text in our search for trying to understand what did the original Hebrew Bible read. And I'll remind you that in textual criticism, that goal of finding the precise wording, everything matters. The word order, even in the language when word order is not necessary to communicate the intent. Textual criticism wants to know the word order. They want to know the tense, and they want to know, is it masculine, is it feminine? They want to know everything about the original writing. I hope this gives you an overview, gives you a taste for some of the things that are out there in support, by and large, of what we call the Masoretic text and the traditional reading of the Hebrew Old Testament. Next, like I said, next week we're going to talk about the canonicity of the Bible. If you have a Bible, I'd highly encourage you to have it available for that lecture so that you can look at some of the references we make in discussing those things. Thank you for your time.